How do you know my name?
Hang up, Matthew.
I didn't tell you my name.
Hang up.
I didn't tell him my name.
This happened a year ago. My husband and I were fairly newly married, moving into our first place together. We knew a family friend who owned property in various places around our state and had a condo unit available in one of the more sketchy towns, but he was going to let us rent it very cheaply. We moved in during September, and then the strange events happened in March and then later on. I'll try my best to explain the layout of this place. We live in the same building as my stalker, although we do not use the same stairwell, as each building is separated into 2 sets of 6 apartments, 2 apartments on each level. We lived at the top on the 3rd floor, and he lived on the bottom of his cluster. He had the handicapped accessible apartment that was closest to the parking lot. One evening, my husband and I went to the grocery store, got into a bit of a fight on the drive home, so he dropped me off with the groceries and drove off to spend some time alone. He dropped me off at our usual parking spot, and I walked up the sidewalk with our groceries. He had already driven off, so he wasn't around for what happened next. While walking down the sidewalk from the parking lot to my stairwell, I passed by the stalker's unit. Once I was directly parallel to his front door, this man yanked open the door and ran out, so he was standing about 15 feet away from me. He was a mid-20s to early 30s guy wearing shorts and a t-shirt, and the creepiest thing about him was that he had this giant grin plastered on his face. I gave him a distrusting look and kept walking, but he started following behind me, about 10 feet back. I looked over my shoulder at him, and he was still grinning this creepy grin, so I ran up the stairs with my groceries. I was afraid he was going to follow me up the stairs and that I wouldn't be able to get inside my house fast enough because I had to get my keys from our lockbox. But he stayed at the bottom of the stairwell, just grinning up at me from below, and watched me race. But he stayed at the bottom of the stairwell, just grinning up at me from below, and watched me race inside. I locked the door and tried to look out the closest window, but couldn't get a great look at him. But I did see him walking calmly back to his own apartment. I was seriously freaked out. What just happened? I mean, is he retarded? Is he crazy? Is he just a gross, scary stalker? I didn't know who or what to tell about this because I wasn't sure if this was worth telling, or if someone would just tell me, hey, it's fine. It's just a weird thing that happens sometimes. I decided to call my brother, and I told him about it. Once my husband got back, I told him too, and he said, that is strange. It's probably okay, though. Just take note if anything strange like that happens again. So I brushed it off, kind of chalked it up to the guy being a mentally challenged person or someone who just didn't understand social cues. And I forgot about it after a week. But 2 months later, it happened again. It was now May, and I hadn't seen the creepy guy since. I never saw him outside walking around or walking to a car. I mean, it seemed like he never left his apartment. I had already written off what had happened, so I wasn't concerned about him anymore. But then, of course, he struck again. The events were almost identical to the first time. I came home in the evening. I dropped my husband off back at work to work late, as he didn't have a car. I parked in our usual spot in the lot and walked up the sidewalk. As I passed his door, he ran out again, creepy grin plastered on his face, but this time he was only wearing a towel that was wrapped around his waist. So I ran up to my apartment, and he followed me on the sidewalk for a bit, but this time he didn't stand at the bottom just staring up at me. He walked back home calmly. I ran inside and started crying and frantically called my husband. I could hardly get out what happened, but when I finally did, he told me he's going to call our friends who live across the street and have them walk over and take me back to their place. They came and picked me up, and then we called the police when we got to their place. The police came out, I told them my story, and they told me they can't charge him because he didn't do anything illegal, but they will make a report of it. We called the HOA president and reported this to him to see if there was anything he could do about it, and the president immediately asked, "Was it such and such apartment?" Yeah, it was. How did he know? Apparently, there have been many incidents with him. He had followed other women, watched little girls swim for hours at the pool out front, and even delivered a pair of his underwear to a woman. Yikes. So we asked the HOA president if there was anything the HOA can do, and he says he'll talk to the owner of the unit and see what they want to do about him. But it turned out that it's his mom who owned the place, and he was just living there by himself, creeping on as many people as he liked. On the phone, she seemed very cooperative and said, "Oh, yeah, I'll evict him then." But nothing ever happened. She never spoke with the HOA again and just dodged their calls, so it was like we were stuck with this creeper. And of course, that couldn't have been the last encounter we had with this guy. It was mostly small things, like he would stare out his window at me sometimes as I was going out to my car, or other times as I was driving through the lot. And there was another time when he was out on the lawn actually in front of his unit, watching girls swim in the pool. It was a Sunday, so my husband and I were going to church, and we passed by him sitting on the lawn, and I didn't even realize it was him. I couldn't remember what his face looked like because he had looked so generic. I'm pretty sure, though, he had changed his hair color, and I didn't know if he was from that unit or the one above him. A lot of things went through my head that caused me to doubt who this guy really was. So we simply passed him by and smiled. Only later did I realize it was him, and I was so mad that my husband didn't get to punch his lights out. And although all these small things were happening, it wasn't enough to motivate us to move yet. Until July. My husband and I had gone camping with our church for a week, and when we got back, we went to hang out with some friends, and we didn't get home until late. We pulled in around 1:30 a.m., and my husband had to go close our pools, and we worked for a pool company and opened and closed pools daily. Just locked doors and turned off the lights and such. So he dropped me off at home to get ready for bed, and he watched me go inside to make sure I was okay, and then he left. He came home about an hour later, around 2:30, and the creepy guy was standing on the sidewalk in front of our usual spot, shirtless. We assumed the stalker was expecting me to be the one driving home alone, and upon seeing that it was my husband, he booked it back to his apartment. My husband parked as fast as he could and ran after him, but the guy was already inside. My husband pounded on the door, yelling at him to come out, but he wouldn't. My husband came up to our apartment and told me what happened, and he grabbed my pepper spray and a heavy object and went back outside to patrol the area because he was so riled up and angry. We ended up moving 2 weeks later, no longer wanting to endure the harassment. Best decision we ever made. So, to the creepy guy who stalked me for months, let's not meet again. This has been written in 3 sessions over 12 days. I had an unusual sighting this morning, January 7th, 2019. Most weekday mornings, weather permitting, I take our dog Sadie Mae for a poo stroll of approximately 3/4 of a mile, maybe 30 minutes starting around 5:30 a.m. For those curious, I always have 3 poo bags on hand, more if I'm with Sadie. We see, for the most part, the same people doing the same things with very little variation every day. First, a little description of the area. After taking a right turn on the right-hand side of the street, there are 2 houses, followed by a small cemetery, followed by more houses until the next right turn, about a half a mile. On the left, in the corner, is a church house followed by woods. The house nearest the cemetery has a motion sensor light which Sadie and I activate most mornings from the street. The cemetery covers roughly an acre, and most of the names on the stones are the same as the name of the street upon which we walk. The church is located between the 2 houses. The church's house is a house owned by the church which has been used to house hospice patients to keep them near their church and minister. How many people have died in that house, I can't say, but certainly more than half a dozen in the 20 years we've lived here. Currently, the church house is unoccupied and undergoing renovations. This morning, after making the right turn, I saw a man walking towards us from the direction of the cemetery. There are a number of houses beyond the cemetery, so he could have come from one of them. But there were two things remarkable about this. First, he's the first person I've seen walking at this hour of the day in this location, and I've been on this walk for 6 or 7 years. I've seen people out and about, and normally I see 2 or 3 cars and 2 or 3 people walking from their doors to their cars. And maybe once or twice a week, if we're running a tad late, I see an elderly neighbor get his morning paper from near the end of his driveway. Second, this man didn't set off the motion sensor light, which Sadie and I did as we passed the house. Now, I'm a large man, and Sadie and I together make a much larger target for the motion sensor than most people. But the cuddle wife has told me she and Sadie have set off the motion sensor when they've passed too, so I can't come up with a plausible reason why this guy didn't set off the sensor. When I first saw him, he was in the area where Sadie and I normally set off the light, so I had at first assumed that the sensor wasn't on. That happens from time to time, but Sadie and I activated it after passing him. I can't really describe him too well. It was dark and he was wearing dark clothes. We did, however, exchange greetings. I didn't recognize the voice, but I don't know everyone who lives back there. Sadie reacted to him as well, the way she reacts to most strangers, friendly and wagging her tail. After Sadie and I activated the motion sensor, I turned to take another look at the man, but I couldn't see him. Whether this was because he blended into the background, made the turn, or went into a house, I can't with certainty say. I think I would have heard him enter a house if he had, because I do hear people leave their houses in the quiet of that hour. I should also mention that other than walking for exercise or visiting neighbors, there's no reason to be walking around this area. The nearest place of business is the county complex, about 1.5 miles away, and the nearest store is some 10 miles away. There's no bus stop, nor is there any other public transportation of any kind here. The area is becoming increasingly suburban, but still remains pretty rural. January 14th, 2019. It's been a week since I saw that mysterious figure, and I've not seen him since. Over the weekend, I was able to ascertain that no one new had moved into the neighborhood, and over the course of the week, Sadie and I performed some experiments to determine just how far away from the house a walker must be for the motion sensor light not to be activated. The result was that I could not pass the house without tripping the sensor, even when I walked along the tree line across the fence, giving an additional 6 feet of open grass. I can't conceive of a way that individual could have passed the motion sensor without activating it. A second point Sadie and I looked into was my inability to see him after we had activated the light. Taking some crude measurements and reenacting the events as best I could determined that the figure could not have made the corner had he maintained his pace. He'd have been perhaps 25 yards short of the point. This would have put him in the field of light coming from the first house's front window, which is usually on at that time of day. This makes my inability to see him and the event even odder than I had first assumed. January 18th, 2019. By now I was hoping to find more information, specifically another sighting which would convince me that what I had seen was a man. However, on this morning's poo stroll, we had another very different encounter. Prior coming to our first corner, I noticed a large white form in the yard beside the church house. The form was about 6 feet tall, and there appeared to be a smaller sphere sitting atop a much larger structure, giving the overall impression of a human-like form. The whole form seemed to be changing shape like a poorly defined mist, and given that I was looking for the figure I had seen before, I was somewhat taken aback. I stopped, and I observed the form for quite a bit. Sadie showed neither fear nor even interest in the apparition, so we sallied forth and discovered to my amusement and relief it was a freshly installed propane tank. As I mentioned, the church house is undergoing renovation. The shape-changing impression was caused by shadow cast by trees moving slowly in the light breeze. I included this tale to show that I am not given to seeing things which aren't there, and that when I see something I can't explain, I'm given to investigating it. I admit readily that my earlier sighting has led to my imagination playing tricks on me. So, to everyone who's paid attention this far, what do you think the figure might have been? I'd like to think it was a man, but I can't get around the facts it didn't set off the motion sensor light, and that it seemed to vanish when it got behind me. If it was only that I lost sight of it after passing, I wouldn't be so bothered by this. And if it was a paranormal or supernatural entity, it's a type I am unfamiliar with. It didn't inspire fear in either of us. It did respond to my greeting, though I can't recall exactly what it said. And it struck me as a normal response. In body type, it seemed like a perfectly normal man of average height and weight, maybe somewhat smaller than myself. So I'd like some thoughts. Any thoughts, ideas, or ideas for tests would be appreciated. I will say this. Since I saw that figure, I lock the house when I leave with Sadie. Something I never did before.